Debt is vital to the functioning of the world economy, but after soaring in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic of recent years, with negative supply shocks persisting and the world's major central banks scrambling to rein in inflation, debt risks are becoming increasingly alarming. The majority of low-income developing countries are today either already in or near debt distress. Meanwhile, the world's two largest economies, the US and China, are expected to see a jump in their public debt at higher levels than before the pandemic. Ghana and Sri Lanka defaulted on their external debt in 2022, 2 years after Zambia did. Pakistan and Egypt are on the verge of a default. On June 30th, Pakistan secured a tentative $3 billion funding deal with the International Monetary Fund, promising a potential short-term relief. Global public debt levels remain high at 92% of gross domestic product at the end of 2022, despite falling from the record levels seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, when they touched 100% of GDP at the end of 2020. Amid the current state of debt distress, a question arises: is the debt crisis a global contagion? Are low-income countries more susceptible to risks compared to others? Let's find out in today's program. So, is the debt crisis a global contagion? Are low-income countries at a much higher risk than the others? The short answer is that the growing debt of poor countries is alarming, but there is no evidence of a contagion that could trigger a global crisis yet. However, economists and debt management experts say richer countries need to act fast to bring relatively new creditors, including China and the private sector, on board for debt restructuring deals for a quicker economic recovery and to avoid a repeat of the 1980s debt crisis that hobbled dozens of less developed nations for years. The COVID-19 pandemic crushed economic activity globally, leading to revenue shortages and increased spending by governments to shield the economy from the adverse effects of a slowdown and layoffs. As a result, global public debt shot up the highest in a year, from 84% of GDP at the end of 2019 to 100% a year later. Poorer nations, which were hit the worst by the public health crisis, had to depend more on external loans to survive. Colombian Finance Minister Mr. Jose Antonio Ocampo points out that it is precisely the poorer countries that have to face the most direct risks. He states, hindered by financial conditions and strong currency depreciation, dozens of developing nations are on the brink of a debt crisis or have already defaulted. The international community's relief efforts have still not been sufficient. About 60% of low-income developing countries are now either high risk or in debt distress and have either had or are about to start a debt restructuring process. This figure was 40% before the pandemic. The debt situation was compounded by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, which led to an increase in global commodity and food prices. In addition to the complex coordination, the lack of agreement among creditors can lead to even more negative effects, such as sudden capital reversals and banking crises. Now, the resurgence of inflation means major central banks have increased interest rates, making the cost of debt servicing costly, and this is a problem for both low-income and middle-income countries, according to Hugo Paniza, a professor of economics at the Geneva-based Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. In all 52 developing countries, home to half of the world's population, living in extreme poverty, are facing severe debt problems and high borrowing costs. As often happens amid crisis, the dollar's value strengthened over 2022 compared with most emerging and advanced economy currencies, as investors' demand grew for the US currency, viewed as a safe asset. This, in turn, has made it even costlier for lower and middle-income countries to meet their debt obligations, as most cross-border loans and international debt is denominated in US dollars. Judith Tyson, a research fellow who specialized in private investment and financial development at the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI, said a lot of global liquidity coming up for refinancing is in dollars, and if your currency deteriorates, as it happened in the case of Ghana, where the cedi collapsed, your ability to meet the debt payments is hugely damaging. Ghana's currency, the cedi, lost more than 50% of its value between January and October 2022, causing Ghana's debt burden to rise by $6 billion. Ghana defaulted on most external debt in December and now aims to reduce its external debt repayments of $20 billion by half over the next 3 years to secure a $3 billion loan deal from the IMF as a part of its debt restructuring. Yet the struggles of Ghana, Sri Lanka, Zambia, and dozens of other nations teetering on the edge of default are not unprecedented. The oil price shocks of the 1970s led to high spells of inflation, pushing the global economy into a recession in 1981 as central banks hiked interest rates to control the high price rise. As many as 16 Latin American countries, led by Mexico and 11 other less developed countries, had to reschedule their debts, prompting the first global debt crisis. The period of the 1980s is also referred to as the lost decade, as many less developed countries agreed to spending cuts on infrastructure, health, and education in exchange for debt restructuring, with several nations ending the decade with income levels that were lower than in 1980. More than 30 cases of unsustainable debt from poor countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, led to the creation of a joint debt relief measure by the IMF and the World Bank, known as the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative in 1996. Countries had to meet certain criteria and commit to policy changes to reduce poverty to receive 100% relief on eligible debts from the IMF, the World Bank, and the African Development Fund. The explosion of unsustainable debt ratios implied that many borrowers, households, corporations, banks, shadow banks, governments, and even entire countries were insolvent zombies that were being propped up by low interest rates, which kept their debt servicing costs manageable. During both the 2008 global financial crisis and the COVID-19 crisis, many insolvent agents that would have gone bankrupt were rescued by zero or negative interest rate policies. As per Zeromin Zettelmeyer, the director of Brussels-based economic think tank Bruegel, there are similarities and differences between the present debt situation and past shocks. Zettelmeyer said the debt crisis does not look global in scale for now, and in the worst case could be confined to developing countries. In their April paper, he and his colleagues concluded that debt vulnerabilities in low-income countries were substantially less alarming than they were in the 1990s. Zettelmeyer said the economic fundamentals of poorer nations also look stronger than in the 1980s and 1990s. In the case of Sri Lanka and Zambia, Zettelmeyer said their defaults were the result of poor domestic economic management, with the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbating the situation. These developments are coinciding with the return of stagflation or high inflation alongside weak growth. The last time advanced economies experienced such conditions was in the 1970s, but at least back then, debt ratios were very low. Today, we are facing the worst aspects of the 1970s, which means stagflationary shocks, alongside the worst aspects of the global financial crisis. And this time, we cannot simply cut interest rates to stimulate demand. And that has come to an end of our program today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.